The purpose of this podcast is to educate and inform. It does not provide legal advice. It does not create an attorney-client relationship. While the host is not a lawyer, the content is overseen by licensed counsel. If you need help with a legal matter, you should always consult with a qualified attorney.
We live in a world where professional advice is everywhere. You can open up your phone and find someone confidently telling you just exactly what to do about your workplace, your boundaries, your clients, your employer, maybe even your professional license. And sometimes that advice sounds great. It may come from someone with a few capital letters after their name. Maybe they've got a big following or a really strong personal brand. But if you are a licensed professional, the question is not just, does this sound right? The question is this actually right? Is this advice coming from someone who is qualified to advise me on this issue? And could following it put my license at risk? This is Know Your Regulator. I'm Simone Murphy, your host, and today I'm joined by the managing partner of Bertolino Law Firm, Tony Bertolino, to talk about how professionals can evaluate advice, verify credentials, and know when it's time to seek guidance from someone who understands their specific regulatory obligations. Tony, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's been a while since I've been on, so I'm happy to be back.
Yeah, happy to talk to you today. We know that there is, a ton of licensed professionals hearing advice from a lot of different avenues these days: social media, podcasts, coworkers, supervisors. There are consultants out there, and now there's professional influencers. Tony, why does it really matter so much who professionals choose to listen to?
Well, I don't think the problem is that people are getting this advice. We all get it. We all do. The problem is deciding whose advice is actually worth following. A lot of people sound convincing, and that doesn't really mean they're right. I mean, you see it all the time. These, highly influential people, very persuasive online, social media. Very charismatic. So the first question shouldn't be, do I agree with this? Do I agree with what information they're telling me? It should be, why should I trust this person on this issue? What really makes them qualified? What gives them the so-called expertise or the rights to speak on these kinds of topics? And for example, if you're really trying to become a better nurse, then you learn from great nurses. If you're trying to build a business, you learn from people who've done it well and those high-end entrepreneurs.
Hmm.
But when a decision could affect your license, you're really in a different world. The rules are different, and so are the consequences. And at the end of the day, your licensing board isn't going to ask, who gave you this advice or these suggestions or direction. They're really going to ask, why did you make this decision in the first place? That's really going to be the bottom line.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And something we talk about a lot on here, as you know, is that even if someone means well, or, the licensed professional has good intentions, they are still responsible for their actions, and they're still responsible if they hear bad advice, they are still responsible for what happens next. And there can be a lot of confusion for license holders. People online present themselves as experts by either listing degrees or credentials, titles. Most people really just pull from their personal experience, though. So,
Oh,
how
yes.
should a license holder evaluate that information?
Well, credentials are fine. A lot of people have them. They go to school, they've earned these degrees, but the credentials really, they don't tell the whole story. Someone can be really good at what they do and still not be the right person to answer your question. I always come back to one thing, are you qualified to do what? I've seen people assume that because someone has letters after their name or a big online following, they must know what they're talking about. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. I would question it. Experience matters, but it needs to be the right experience. If the issue involves your professional license, ask whether this person actually understands the regulatory process, the licensing process. And that's a much better question than, how many followers do they have? A lot of
Yeah.
people, run on that belief that, hey, there's a million followers, they've hit the million mark, or
Hmm.
many, many millions. That doesn't matter. You got to go deeper into your understanding of who that who that person is and what they really do offer in the form of advice and guidance.
That's a big distinction that you've made there because someone can be really knowledgeable about the subject and they,
Oh yeah.
may have had quite a bit of experience in one aspect of the field, but they may not necessarily know about the specific rules
That's
and, your governing agency. So you have to be very careful. Like you said, it's a big distinction.
really
When
is.
we're talking about evaluating this, what are some of the red flags that should make a licensed professional pause, or maybe something that, kind of just sets it off in their brain? Like, I need to kind of stop and rethink this before following someone's advice.
I think it really comes down to, the biggest one is advice that has too much of an absolute kind of language. Someone says, quote, always do this or, quote, never do that. Be
Yeah.
careful with that kind of advice and suggestions because the real answer to that is it always depends, right? There's never any absolutes really in anything, particularly with, this kind of issue when you're going online or you're following advice from people that you need to sort of think twice about. It really comes down to avoiding that kind of suggestion or advice that places these kinds of absolute language to it. The real situations usually aren't that simple. It really does always boil down to, well, it depends. What are these,
Exactly.
these facts that may affect it? So I'd always be cautious if you never mention your state rules or your licensing boards. And there's a lot out there that will do that. They'll just go off on these vague kind of advice or suggestions. And when it comes to the board and your practice, those details really matter. That they become very critical. Another red flag is someone telling you to take a big step without talking about what could happen afterwards, the consequences.
Mm,
Those are always critical as well, is
yeah.
knowing what those potential, at least the potential consequences are to your actions. And honestly, ask yourself whether they're trying to educate you or entertain you. Those aren't always the same thing. These influences, for example, that are out there, they're really doing it just to get the likes and to up their followers and to really entertain you and to be charming and charismatic on film and do funny things and to do things that will attract you and perhaps make you laugh and truly entertain you. But are they doing it to educate you? Likely not. They're not there to certainly look out for your best interest, but they're also, I don't think, looking to, truly educate you on the topics.
That is a huge, huge just distinction that you bring up and a really big red flag. Absolutely. Are they there to
Yes,
entertain you or educate you?
they
Because
are.
social media really, really rewards confidence and authority. And so you can be bringing all those things to a social media
Yeah,
platform, but not really speaking on the regulatory issues and the impact surrounding that. So, yeah,
right.
those require a lot of caution and understanding, not so much entertainment for sure. So, what practical steps can a license holder or even really a member of the public to take to verify whether someone is actually qualified to be giving advice on a professional licensing issue?
I'd keep it very, very simple. Ask yourself why this person is qualified to answer this question that you may have. Not every expert or someone that advises you is going to be an expert, so to speak, in everything. You look at what they actually do. Have they worked with people in your particular profession? Do they have their own credentials, perhaps? Do they have their own experiences that they can, back up with some of the advice that they're presenting? Do they understand your licensing board specifically? Have they dealt with situations like yours? Have they been or have they perhaps known of others who have been in similar situation like yours? And then you compare what they're saying with your board rules or guidance. If those two things line up, that's a good sign to slow down before you act. And really, not to bolster or try to encourage you to hire a lawyer or anything, or even hire me. But I would advise that you speak to legal counsel just to make sure and just to double check and to make sure that a lot of what is being presented to you is accurate. Because at the end of the day, you're looking at major consequences if you don't.
Yeah, if you want to talk about someone who for sure knows the rules and regulations and how some certain advice or certain actions can impact your license, it's definitely a professional licensed attorney who would
Right.
have all of that knowledge and who would be able to dive in and give you that best advice on what to do next or how this advice may fit your situation. So,
Exactly.
yeah,
Very
absolutely. It's
true.
really doing that due diligence, kind of finding, vetting that person and if you need it, finding that person who will be able to give you that information. So, yeah. When we're talking about guidance and advice just being thrown out into the wild on social media, where is the line drawn between just generally helpful information and maybe more of that entertainment that we were talking about and advice that a licensed professional should not rely on without further guidance, that they should then probably seek an attorney or kind of, do that due diligence.
General information is very helpful. That's why this podcast like this exists, right? I mean, it's providing good general information. It's generally educating folks out there and license holders in particular. But general information certainly has its limits. A podcast can't know your specific facts. A social media post can't know what specifically happened in your situation. Questions like whether you should report something or self-report or respond to an investigator or ways to respond to a board investigator. Decision whether to resign from your current job position in light of a complaint notice that came in the mail for you, or even disclose something to a board. All depend on those specific facts in your case. So once the decision could affect your license, don't assume someone else's answer automatically fits your situation because it doesn't always. The bottom line is don't rely on general vague information that's out there. You've got to make sure that you get into the detailed facts of your complaint, of your situation, of an investigation that maybe happened to you, and base your decisions and the information and guidance only on that. Don't go
Yeah.
vague. Don't rely on vagueness.
Great way to put it because you could use that information as a starting point, maybe, but if you're
Right.
using it as your final answer, I mean, you're just skipping a ton in between and really narrowing your own options there. So, before a license holder acts on advice that they heard online or from a self proclaimed expert, what can a license holder do? What should they do?
I would stop for a minute and ask a few questions. Ask yourself a few questions. First, who's giving me this advice? What makes them qualified to answer this particular question, whether it be a specific legal question or a very general fact question about your case or about the matter or complaint perhaps that you may be facing? Does this actually apply to my profession and my licensing board? Look to see, whether there's that proper application to your own scenario. And what happens if they're wrong? That's an important question to always ask. Again, when we talked about this, the consequences. You're the one who has to live with the outcome at the end of the day. It's your license. It's your responsibility. Taking a few minutes to check the source is a lot easier than trying to fix that mistake later on. I tell you, that's the God honest truth.
Absolutely, and it's way less stressful, to be totally honest with you.
Yeah.
We see it day in and day out that clients are just sometimes reeling from this time in their life that it's so stressful. So I absolutely agree. It's so important to slow down before you make a really big decision. It's, usually one that you can't easily undo later. So take the time to do the due diligence now, right? Yeah. Well,
You
Tony,
know,
thank you so much for joining me.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you very much. I do want to just, throw in just really three key
Yeah,
takeaways with all of
go
this,
for
just to
it.
wrap everything up. But I think the first thing that must be taken into consideration by the viewers, particularly those that are out there watching this podcast that have a license, is most people don't get into trouble because they were trying to do the wrong thing. They get into trouble because they trusted advice that didn't fit their situation. I see it all the
Yeah,
time. They take on the wrong suggestion, they look at the wrong source. That's what gets you in trouble. Don't mistake confidence for expertise. There's a lot of people out there that look confident. Yeah, again, we talked about that. They're very, very charming, very charismatic on film, and got a lot of video posts and such. And along with that, don't assume a title or a big audience means someone has the right answer. That's not always the case. And that really applies to everything, right? Not just the topic of today's discussion, this podcast, but really just the way you view social media generally, and noticing the big audience out there. Again, that doesn't really mean they have that correct answer. And then finally, find someone who actually knows the issues you're dealing with. That's usually the safest place to start. You used the term earlier, the due diligence. You're spot on with that, Simone. If more people did those kinds of things, you'd certainly find that those people would be in a much safer place from the very beginning.
I like that safer place because that's really what it is. It's a risk to your license when you're
That's right.
letting this information influence you. And there is so much information out there that can be confusing to, know what to listen to, who to
That's right.
follow, what is and isn't legitimate. But you keep it real simple, right? Licensed professionals, you guys just need to be careful about who you allow to influence your decisions that would affect your career, your license,
Mhm.
your livelihood. I mean, this is what you've worked so hard to earn. So, don't jeopardize it because of someone else's advice.
For sure.
Well, thank you, Tony. Thanks for joining me
Thank
and
you.
breaking this down for our license
Yes.
holders.
I
I think we've
appreciate the
given
time.
them,
You.
yeah, absolutely. We have definitely given them some practical advice and some steps that they can use to maybe pause and think about their decisions moving forward. So, thanks.
Absolutely. You're welcome.
Listeners, remember that a strong platform, polished content, or impressive sounding credentials should not replace verification. Before you follow advice, check the source, check the credentials, check your governing rules. And when the stakes are high, like with your professional license on the line, get guidance from someone who understands your regulatory obligations and your profession. Until next week, stay inspired and continue engaging with your regulatory agency.
Know Your Regulator, the podcast that inspires you to engage.